No one ever asked me that question. Thank you so much for asking that.
No.
Assumed that mindfulness would help you sleep better, and when I got the data back, it was the exact opposite of what I thought. It was actually the mindfulness group actually had, more cortical arousal, more awakenings, less deep sleep, and that was highly correlated with their amount of practice.
Something that I've noticed is that, so people say, notice the thought, pay attention to your thoughts, but often that's a challenge in itself, because when you've lived your whole life experiencing this phenomenon of thoughts just keep coming in, sometimes they don't even notice that it's going on.
More importantly, 1 in 10 would have a meditation-related adverse effect that either lasted a month or longer or was associated with impairment in functioning. Often there's this idea that the more you meditate, the better. And that you can, it's just like a linear progress that you just go up and up and up and up and up, and the more you get, the better. But you can actually overtrain certain skills. I think the mystery is what matters most. I think if you try to grab onto any particular thing or answer, then you get stuck there. There's always going to be more stuff that you don't understand, and that's awesome.
First question, to jump straight into it, it's, give us a few things that we would need to understand about your upbringing and your childhood that kind of sets the stage, or, how you ended up where you are. I'd love to get a little insight into that.
No one ever asked me that question. Thank you so much for asking that.
No.
So I grew up on a farm in Massachusetts.
Ooh.
And we had a lot of forest around, and I spent a lot of time by myself in the forest. So I think that was a very important starting point for my nervous system, and also just my mind. I was sort of naturally contemplative. I spent a lot of time in my own mind, my own space, and also had a very deep connection with nature. And, I talked to trees and I talked to frogs, and that was, I think it seemed normal to me at the time, but I realize now that spending that much time by yourself as a kid maybe is a little unusual. So I think that's, an important starting point, and kind of got me, very interested in consciousness. My parents used to tell me that I was kind of a strange child, and I would ask questions like, what is looking out of my eyes? Is today tomorrow?
Wow.
Things like that. Just, I was very curious about, what are we? Why are we here? All the, basic existential questions. That was always, and I eventually went into neuroscience because I thought that would be the way to answer some of those questions about, what are we? What is consciousness? What is looking out of my eyes? It must be in there somewhere, right? But it was much more complicated than that when I got there. So.
Yeah, it's quite interesting how, some of the questions that you are pondering, it seems like the more that we explore, it was almost, you naturally get to that point where you do ask yourself those questions, right? It's some of the big ones.
Yeah.
So can you explain a little bit about so now what you're doing now, and the role that you play and where you're doing it?
So I'm an Associate Professor of Psychiatry and Human Behavior and Behavioral and Social Sciences in Brown University Medical School and School of Public Health. I've been a mindfulness researcher for about 25 years, and I'm the director of the Clinical and Affective Neuroscience Lab at Brown. And I mean, I study, contemplative practices, mental training, from, a neuropsychological perspective, and through various, different studies, the first study that I ever did, which was my dissertation study, I was looking at the effects of mindfulness training on sleep, but I was measuring sleep biologically with brainwaves, and, just assumed that mindfulness would help you sleep better. And when I got the data back, it was the exact opposite of what I thought. It actually the mindfulness group actually had, more cortical arousal, more awakenings, less deep sleep, and that was highly correlated with their amount of practice. And so that was very surprising to me. And then I actually didn't publish that data because I was afraid that I had done something wrong, or that I wasn't kind of promoting mindfulness, because I was very much a fan and an evangelist at that point. And so during that, while I was sort of sitting on the data, I went on a meditation retreat and mentioned to the teacher what I had found. And they said, "Oh, I don't know why you psychologists are always trying to make meditation into a relaxation technique. Everyone knows if you meditate enough that you stop sleeping." And I was like, "What?" That was shocking to me. And so that kind of was like a little seed that was planted in my mind. And then when I did my residency at Brown, I worked in an inpatient psychiatric hospital, and there were two yogis that came off of a intensive retreat nearby, and they were like completely psychotic. And so I went back to that same teacher, and I was like, "Have you ever seen this before?" And it was clear that the meditation teachers knew a lot more than they were sort of advertising to the public, and that as a meditation researcher, I needed, we needed to understand more about other kinds of experiences that happen besides just the health benefits. And so I started in 2007, I started a study called the Varieties of Contemplative Experience study, which was basically just to go to these meditation teachers, many of which because they run major centers like across the US and Canada and Europe, and just ask them, like, what kind of challenges have you observed in your students? How do you make sense of them? And then what do you do about it? And what was actually kind of shocking was that a number of the teachers that we interviewed had their own experiences. Actually, 60% of the sample of the people who were reporting kind of challenging experiences were teachers. And so we've learned that this is actually a pretty common phenomenon. And so that became the study called the Varieties of Contemplative Experience study. And it took us 10 years to collect the data. We have over 3,000 pages of transcripts, and we've published about 16 papers on various challenges. And we've documented 59 categories of challenges, and then kind of how different stories about how people kind of work with them. And then when we published our first paper in 2017, actually Dan Harris did a podcast on it the day it was released, and so there was a lot of media attention.
I love me some Dan.
Yeah. And we got the lab just started getting calls from meditators all over the world who were like having different challenges and needed help. And so, a university like neuroscience lab is not a hotline, so I had to start a nonprofit called Cheetah House to be more of the service arm of the lab, so that we could actually, help people. And so now, much later, Cheetah House is a peer support nonprofit. So we offer everyone on our care team has had some sort of meditation challenge that they worked through themselves. And we offer, one-on-one support, peer support, and we also educate meditation teachers and clinicians about the various types of meditation challenges and how to work with them. I did a 20-hour meditation safety training called First Do No Harm with my husband, Jared Lindahl, who's a Buddhist studies scholar, and then David Trelevin, who wrote the book Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness. And so the sort of trauma-informed approach to mindfulness is very much kind of a foundational part of what we do and what we train clinicians in. So that's me. I'm sort of famous for researching the meditation related challenges, and I've probably published more studies on the benefits of meditation, but I'm known for the more, I don't know,
The
sexy topic
balance.
the balance.
So a question that I love to ask because it's so simple,
Yeah.
but it's can you describe mindfulness?
Well, mindfulness
Exactly.
has a,
Yeah, I know because it's for so
mindfulness
many
has a lot
people,
of.
and yeah,
So I was trained by Jon Kabat-Zinn, and he's famously said, like, held up Full Catastrophe Living, the book that he wrote, that was like basically the summary of MBSR, the program
yeah,
that he created. And the newest version of Full Catastrophe Living is like 600 pages. I mean, the thing is like this big.
yeah.
And so he would say, like, this is mindfulness, like
Oh,
this huge book. And
yeah,
he's also famously said that, mindfulness is a an umbrella term for,
yeah,
the entire teachings of the Buddha Dharma. So
yeah,
that's like also thousands and thousands of pages. So I think it's a moving target, and I think it depends on who you ask. Some people are, I've trained also in very, very sort of traditional Buddhist lineages
yeah.
where, they think what John is doing is not mindfulness, and what they're
Mm,
doing is, there's kind of mindfulness, there's very, very
yeah,
strict people who have a very Buddhist idea, and then there's people that are much more on the applied side of things.
mhm,
I would put you more on the applied side of things where you're like, we're going to take, various techniques and ideas and we're going to apply them in a way that, is very useful to the people that are using it.
sure,
And, if
yeah,
there are certain ideas that don't work or don't fit, we're not
hmm,
going to, force them on people. So
yeah,
yeah, I think there's a range of different meanings, and I think that's, in my opinion, I think that's good. I know that some
yeah,
people, want to have their meaning be the one that
yeah, for sure.
wins.
What is love?
Yeah,
You know.
right.
Well, you use the word mindfulness and meditation. Do you cross use those? Do you, or and in the research that you're doing, are you mainly mindfulness research, or is it meditation as well? And do you use those interchangeably?
So, I mean, I did a mindfulness dismantling study, because the term mindfulness and mindfulness meditation is actually many different kinds of meditation.
Yeah,
So, I mean, that's, if you're talking about, it's very audience specific. So if we use the word mindfulness and we're hanging out with Jon Kabat-Zinn and sort of the
yeah,
the secular MBSR MBCT world, that has a
yeah.
very specific meaning. But, if you're walking into a Buddhist,
Right.
I'm married
Mm.
to a Buddhist scholar, so having
Yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah,
having very specific, are you talking about like the Satipatthana Sutta, awareness of breath, that kind of practice, and like,
yeah.
so yeah, I probably use those things interchangeably sometimes, and also realize that both terms can mean a lot of different things, and so we try to be really
Yeah.
specific in our papers.
So, a couple of questions that people have heard as well. What do you think the mindfulness world understands most?
Wow, you're just going right for
Let's
the
go straight
jugular at
into
the
it.
beginning,
Yeah,
huh?
yeah, yeah.
Um, hmm. So I wrote a paper in 2019 called "Can Mindfulness Be Too Much of a Good Thing?"
Mm.
And it's basically taking the inverted U-shaped curve principle, the idea that for any psychological or physiological process, there's an optimal level. And so if you're lacking in that thing, let's say body awareness, then if you don't have a lot of it, you're going to have the biggest gains at the beginning when you're like getting that to the optimal level. But you can actually shoot and have too much body awareness. And then that leads to other problems. And so people with eating disorders or like too much anxiety have way too much body awareness. And so they'd be better off doing a practice where they would reduce body awareness, having some kind of
Yeah,
external anchor. So I think that often there's this idea that, the more you meditate, the better. And that like you can like it's just like a linear progress that like you just go up and up and up and up and up, and like the more you get the better. But you can actually overtrain certain skills, and that, in my opinion, the mindfulness is more about the awareness of figuring out like where you are on this curve, and then for you in this specific situation, what is the optimal level of this given sort of mindfulness skill. And so that would be more of my sort of corrective message if I could give one. Yeah.
Sure. And in the years of research, what are the most common challenges that people have shared or demonstrated?
So the most common challenges are things that I would categorize as dysregulated arousal. And so the most common ones would be hyperarousal symptoms like anxiety, panic, insomnia, racing thoughts, flooding of emotional memories, sometimes traumatic memories, sometimes like twitching or, like kind of jerks, perceptual hypersensitivity. So being very sensitive to like sound and light, sometimes touch, and hyperarousal can also bleed into pain syndromes like headaches and just various kinds of pains, tinnitus, and then on the flip side of that is the hypoarousal symptoms, where you start to see blunted emotions, dissociation, spaciness, and actually a kind of distance from the body awareness. So, and I can explain, if you want to hear how each of those can develop in, according to this U-shaped curve, what you can overtrain and end up in one or the other. But
if I wanted to find out more about the U-shaped curve and, the findings around that, was there a specific paper that was in, or was that on the website?
Yep. So that was a paper it was published in 2019 called "Can Mindfulness Be Too Much of a Good Thing?" Yeah, and
did you have to purchase that?
It's on both my Brown website and the Cheetah House website.
Okay, is that paid for?
No, I make sure that all of my papers are
awesome.
Open access.
Well, I'll definitely put a link to that.
Yeah.
And do you do like the nose and tracking the brain activity? When you say the neuroscience part of it, is that how you get some of the information and the data?
I do EEG. So yeah, I measure brain waves and the physiology, like facial muscles and heart rate and breathing rate and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Have you ever collaborated with Richard Davidson?
I have, actually.
Yeah.
So we actually co-wrote a paper with Simon Goldberg. One of his colleagues was the first author. We did an epidemiological study on the very important question of how frequent are meditation-related challenges. So Richie and I were co-authors on that paper. Do you want to hear what we found?
Please.
So the first statistic was these were adults in America who had meditated at least once in their life. So very low bar in terms of who the denominator was. And we found that almost half of all adults in the US had tried meditation at least once. So that's a very high number. And then we found that half of those people, so half of all adults in the US who had tried meditation at least once, would have at least one, undesirable negative effect. So again, very, very common. And then more importantly, 1 in 10 would have a meditation-related adverse effect that either lasted a month or longer or was associated with impairment in functioning. So 1 in 10 is generally the number that when people ask how frequently does this happen, I don't think, meditation is always easy and you shouldn't expect it to always be fun and pleasant. And so, very transient pieces of unpleasantness, I don't consider that an adverse effect. I consider an adverse effect like when it starts to impact your functioning. And as someone who's training, athletes, I would think that that would resonate. Like,
Yeah, definitely.
working through difficulties, sure, but like, let's make sure this is serving you.
What is your goal moving forward? Is there a mission? Is there what's the vision?
So, I mean, right now we see about, I mean, I don't know, I've seen thousands of meditators in distress, and we see about 150 a month at Cheetah House. And I would like the people who teach meditation to take a little bit more like responsibility for the for the kind of problems that they cause. Like, I'm not teaching the meditation, but I'm taking,
Yeah.
I'm responsible for the kind of fallout. So
Yeah.
I would love to, and I have been training more meditation teachers and clinicians. So, in just learning about the challenges that can happen, and, fairly easy ways of mitigating that, just to teach them that kind of thing, I think would hopefully reduce the numbers. And because meditation is growing, we're seeing even more casualties. So yeah, it's trying to raise awareness, and also help teachers just be a little bit more trauma informed.
Awesome. Now, in my teaching, something that I've noticed is that people say, notice the thought, pay attention to your thoughts, but often that's a challenge in itself, because when you've lived your whole life experiencing this phenomenon of thoughts just keep coming in, sometimes they don't even notice that it's going on. Is that something that is that a problem in meditation training as well that you're seeing?
Being aware that difficulties being aware of thoughts.
Yeah, of noticing thoughts.
I mean, that's a pretty foundational skill, I would say. I mean, some of the basics of mindfulness, I think everyone would benefit from knowing how to do. So being able to recognize a thought as a thought, that's a foundational skill for life. Where it can become a problem, again, sort of overtraining that, is when you basically you sort of take this witnessing stance to your thoughts, and for some people that can be kind of a precursor to or a trigger for dissociation, where you can basically start to become this kind of detached witness to everything, and you're not actually like immersed in your life. You're more of like a fly on the wall.
Yeah.
And I think it's like, I see all of these things as, capacities that we can have, and like they're tools that we can use if useful. And being a fly on the wall and being detached is, if you can like do that on command, like that's a useful thing. But when it's not useful is when you get stuck there.
Yeah.
Or like that's the only trick. You don't want to be a one-trick pony.
Yeah.
You want to be able to have all these different types of states available to you when you want them, but like not to overtrain anything that you get stuck there. Yeah.
All right. Well, last question that I always end the podcast on is, what matters most?
Whew. What matters most?
Mm-hmm. And I'll leave it at that. You can interpret it how you would like.
I think at this moment right now, and this could change in the next moment, but I think the mystery is what matters most. I think if you try to grab onto any particular thing or answer, then you get stuck there. And so just keeping, the mystery of, there's always going to be more stuff that you don't understand, and like that's awesome.
It's truly awesome. Well, thank you so much for doing this, and like I said, I'm going to be in touch very shortly.
All right, thanks a lot.
So